Hey everyone, welcome back. It's been a while since I've done my last build video, but this one is going to be an interesting one. Today we're going to be looking at how I've been buffing Mirage and Chroma in my last two runs. This has been a highly requested video even before the uploads. And well, I thought it was finally a good time to show you how this works. So the weapon I'm using for this is actually the Sigma and Octantis. This is a login reward that is locked behind increments of 200-day logins, I believe, which is a little bit unfortunate, but currently this is the only remaining way I'm aware of to reliably damage yourself. If DE is watching this, please stop removing self-damage from our remaining weapons. The ones that you've been removing from very recently are almost impossible to kill yourself with unless you intentionally build it that way, and even then it still takes a decent amount of time. There's no reason really to remove this from the game at this point when it causes no inconvenience to the players. Just removing self-damage for the sake of removing self-damage. There's a lot of build synergies that these methods can work with even outside of Mirage and Chroma, and it just increased build diversity if you kept this in the game. Nobody has ever killed themselves using Sigma. You've also added self-stagger to a lot more weapons, like 4 to 5 times more weapons than weapons that even had self-damage to start out with. On top of that, it was only about, 5 or 6 self-damage weapons that could even actually kill yourself. At this point, the fact that the only way to use a Kuva Brahma reliably now is instead of constantly suiciding, you just constantly stagger yourself instead if you shoot too close, which honestly I find is worse because then you're just stuck watching yourself get killed because you stagger yourself to death while enemies can still shoot you. There's no real reason for you to have added self-stagger to weapons such as the Sonic Core and Static Core, which have become mostly irrelevant these days due to the amount of self-stagger they cause. It was impossible to kill yourself with these weapons to start out with, so I really don't know why this was added to the game. You have other weapons that have self-stagger like the Trumna and Sepulchrum that have it on their regular shots. It's not huge, but it means that if anything gets too close to you, including allied objects for I really don't know why, will interrupt your actions and motions such as cancelling reloads or ability casts or anything, and it just forcing people to run something like Prime Sure-Footed as a band-aid I really don't think is a good solution, especially with the amount of weapons you've added self-stagger to that could never self-damage to start out with. So in conclusion, I just really wish if you would leave the remaining ways of self-damage alone, as they really do not pose a threat to the player base on killing themselves. Everybody here, as you can see, wants to find out how to self-damage because there's so few ways to do it left in the game. So obviously a huge amount of people are not happy with the universal removal of self-damage. Rather, we just wanted weapons that would stop insta-giving us. But ways to cause self-damage, just because we want to do a little bit of chip damage to ourselves, or create synergies like Mirage's Self Heat Proc, yeah, we've always been all for that, and it really doesn't make sense why Chroma and Mirage were caught in the crossfire when you had issues like the Vectis Dispo being nerfed, but Comb was left alone for the longest time because you didn't want to affect the status chance calculation. But the nerf on Vectis completely ruined a lot of tri-stats on making them 1 meg Vectis and completely devaluing them in perspective. On the flip side, the status system was completely overhauled, which some people believe was specifically so that the disposition of Comb could be changed. So DE, please reevaluate why you are removing self-damage from the game when you look at each weapon that might have it, and why the player base would want it removed, as opposed to just universally removing it for the sake of removing self-damage. So let's move on to the main part of this video. Here today we're going to be looking at the self-damage build for our Sigma and Octantis. My main sources of status chance on this weapon will be Volcanic Edge to increase my status chance as well as my heat bias. Then I will be running the new Jugulus, Carnus, and Saxum IPS 60% status mods. I will also be running melee prowess and drifting contact. Lasting sting is being used to increase my heat proc from 6 seconds to 13 seconds. Now, Riven is not mandatory for the Mirage setup, but it helps immensely as there isn't really much else I can run in this final slot. This makes it a little bit restrictive on the build, but if you want consistency, there's no other path you can take. The listed status chance on the weapon up here where I have 89.8% chance is on the swing, and actually the detonate that I use for the self damage has an even lower base status chance. I feel like instead of 16%, it was probably sitting around 10% or less, as it takes me a decent amount of throws to proc my heat on myself. So now let's take a look at how you actually set this up. Like all other shield and swords, you can swing the weapon like this, and if you hold your E, you will do a heavy swing like normal. If you try to slam in the air, you'll just come straight down and hit the ground. But what sets the Sigma and Octantis apart is if you hit E while not aiming straight down in the air, you will instead throw the shield. In this aspect, it works a lot like a glaive, but it naturally detonates at the extent of its range. But just like a glaive, you can also detonate it manually. If you use a heavy attack while it's in flight, it will explode and immediately come back to you. This explosion has no visual animation, but it causes self damage. This is how you use the Sigma and Octantis to heat proc on Mirage. We need to throw the shield while it's in the air and immediately detonate it. For this reason, I've moved my heavy attack when I was doing the runs to my scroll wheel so that as soon as I throw it in the air, I can just flick my scroll wheel and detonate it at the earliest possible opportunity in my face. Because the status chance isn't that high as I stated, even though it's modded for 90% on the swing, you can see it takes a fair amount of throws until I actually proc heat on myself. The explosion also has innate blast, so sometimes you will be procking this instead. All this does is dilute the heat procs that you get, as when you proc blast, you will be unable to proc heat for that swing. When you get better, you'll be able to throw it twice per jump, like shown here. You'll throw it immediately at the start of the jump and again before you touch the ground. If you can get this rhythm going and practice it pretty well, you can get into a series of double throws for each jump and just loop it together until you set up your heat proc. Now you'll notice in my Mirage run, we didn't use a Harrow, we used a Limbo instead. And the reason for this should be clear at this point. I can't consistently proc heat anymore that quickly like you could do in the past with Penta or Castanas. Also, Harrow's Covenant removes all existing status effects and makes you immune to all new status effects during your invulnerability. So this means you have to set up the heat proc after the invulnerability expires. This leaves you with only about 3 or 4 seconds before you have to break the limb, and this is why we chose not to include Harrow in the run. Mirage's Eclipse is strong enough you do not need the extra crit chance when you're on a sniper. Limbo lets you become invincible to the mag spike damage for the entire duration while you can still cause self damage to yourself. The Limbo needs to drop the Cataclysm at the right time towards the end, as you will be unable to pick up the wisps that the DPS makes if you keep this Cataclysm up indefinitely. Obviously, this means you're going to need a decently effective VS comp and that you'll have to wait towards the end of the spike to pick it up. This also means that the DPS is going to have to produce more wisps, but I feel like if you can juggle this and have access to this weapon, you can definitely bring Mirage back as a meta choice in hunts. Now, the other main use I had for Sigma in our run was for Chroma. Luckily, the method for Chroma is much easier. And if you recall how Serata was built, well, it was pretty much the same. You wanted a decent amount of attack speed, you wanted a decent amount of innate damage, and you wanted to mod for pure toxin to bypass your shield so that the detonate could directly impact your health. Now there's another extra little trick here. If I look at the build, you also want to mod on these rank 0s for radiation. And this is important because one of the most common buffs outside of Covenant is a Volt VS trying to shock trooper you. If you don't mod radiation on here like this, even at rank 0, the electric that they give you will combine with your Prime Fever Strike and produce corrosive instead. Now you're going to be unable to damage your health if you need to rebuff when shock trooper is up, and you're going to have to eat through your entire shield and give yourself a massive armor buff first. This makes self-buffing a lot more problematic, and this is why we have 2 rank 0 90% mods to make radiation. Therefore, if the Volt happens to shock trooper you, it will just add into radiation instead, and you will retain this toxin damage as an independent damage type so that you can hit your health directly. Dispatch Overdrive is here so that if you really do need the speed buff, you can use a heavy on the tier list before you fly off back to the shrine. Fury is just here to offset the 20% attack speed penalty from Spoiled Strike, as I'm very used to the base attack speed of Sigma and Octantis at this point. If you want this to work even faster, I guess you could run a higher attack speed, but just note that this makes it a little bit more difficult to time your jumps and your throws, as now you have less time to do your double throw in each jump. So now let's get to looking how this works. We are going to be throwing the shield the same way that we learned with Mirage, like this. You're jumping in the air, throwing it to detonate, and then you throw it again before you land and detonate again. Doing it this way, it's very easy to damage yourself, and honestly, you kind of need to pay attention to what you're doing, because if you just mindlessly do this, you can actually kill yourself. It only takes about 2 or 3 throws on this build to take off 100 health needed to max out your Vex armor. And because you're not relying on status procs and the damage is guaranteed, it's much easier to set up Chroma instead of Mirage. Continue practicing and you should be able to do it just like I show here in the video. 86% of you are not subscribed. Please leave a like and consider subscribing for more daily or near daily content on Warframe builds, Eidolon content, meme runs, and basically just anything Warframe. Thank you all for watching, and I hope that answered all your questions you had about how I've been buffing on Mirage and Chroma. See you all next time.